I didn't wake up one day and realize I had ruined my life. That kind of clarity only exists in stories we tell after the damage is done. What I had was something quieter, slower, and far more dangerous. I betrayed myself a little at a time, so gently that it felt like adaptation. At first, it didn't look like betrayal. It looked like compromise. I told myself I was being realistic, mature, sensible. I learned early that wanting too much made people uncomfortable, so I learned how to want less, or at least how to pretend I did. Each time I swallowed a desire, each time I chose what was expected over what felt true, I told myself it didn't matter. That this was how life worked. And in a way, it was. I built a life that made sense on paper. One that could be explained without embarrassment. One that didn't raise alarms. People trusted me. They relied on me. They saw me as grounded, steady, reasonable. I wore those words like armor, even as they slowly turned into a cage. The first thing I lost wasn't happiness. It was curiosity. I stopped asking questions that didn't have practical answers. I stopped imagining futures that didn't fit neatly into the life I already had. When thoughts appeared that challenged my direction, I dismissed them quickly, like intrusive noise. Over time, that became instinct. Silence felt safer than exploration. I didn't feel miserable. That's what made it so convincing. I functioned. I laughed at the right moments. I planned for the future in ways that impressed people. I was praised for my discipline, my patience, my ability to endure. No one saw what it cost me, because I barely allowed myself to see it either. But there were moments. Small ones. Sharp ones. Like standing in a crowded room, surrounded by familiar faces, and feeling completely alone. Or waking up on a day that should have felt important and realizing it felt no different from any other. Or catching my reflection in a mirror and feeling a strange sense of distance, as if I were looking at someone I knew well but didn't quite recognize. I told myself this was normal. That everyone feels detached sometimes. That adulthood is mostly maintenance. But deep down, something was wrong. I started to feel tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. Not physically, existentially. Conversations drained me. Decisions felt heavy, even small ones. I avoided silence because silence invited thoughts I didn't want to finish. At night, when there was no one to perform for, regret crept in quietly. Not regret for specific choices, but for a pattern I couldn't yet name. I felt like I had missed something important without knowing exactly what it was. Like arriving late to a place where everyone else had already left. The truth I avoided was this: I had made myself smaller to fit into a life that wasn't built for who I was becoming. Each time I stayed quiet to keep the peace. Each time I chose safety over honesty. Each time I delayed change because now isn't the right time. Those moments added up. I began to feel resentment toward situations, toward people, even toward myself without a clear reason. I was angry at things that weren't wrong. That scared me. It made me realize how much of me had been suppressed. Unlived parts don't disappear, they turn into bitterness if ignored long enough. One evening, sitting alone, I asked myself a question that stopped me cold: when was the last time I made a decision that felt like it came from me, not from fear or expectation I couldn't answer? That silence was devastating. I realized how long it had been since I had trusted my own inner voice. How often I had overridden it with logic, obligation, or guilt. I had trained myself to doubt my instincts so thoroughly that they barely spoke anymore. And then came the thought I couldn't shake: what if this is how I live my entire life? Not tragically. Not dramatically. Just competently, quietly, and disconnected from myself. That thought didn't cause panic. It caused grief. Grief for a version of myself I had slowly abandoned. For choices I never made. For risks I never allowed myself to consider. I hadn't failed loudly. I had succeeded at surviving while slowly disappearing. That was the moment I understood something essential: self-betrayal doesn't feel like destruction. It feels like stability. It feels like being praised for endurance while something vital inside you goes unnoticed and unnamed. I didn't change my life that night. I didn't even know how. But the awareness had arrived. And once it does, you can't go back to pretending that numbness is peace. I had spent years betraying myself quietly. Now, for the first time, I could feel the weight of that choice. And it was heavier than I expected. Once I saw it, I couldn't stop seeing it. The pattern. The slow erosion. The way I had learned to disappear without ever leaving the room. Awareness didn't come with relief. It came with discomfort so sharp it felt physical. Every compromise I had made resurfaced in my mind, replaying itself with new meaning. What I once called maturity now looked like fear. What I once called patience now looked like avoidance. And what I once called loyalty looked disturbingly like self-erasure. I began to notice how often my body reacted before my thoughts did. Tightness in my chest when I agreed to something I didn't want. A subtle wave of nausea when I smiled through conversations that felt dishonest. Exhaustion that appeared out of nowhere, as if my nervous system was tired of pretending even when my mind insisted everything was fine. The dark secret I had never admitted, not even to myself, finally took shape. I was afraid that if I stopped betraying myself, I would lose everything that made my life understandable to others. That fear controlled me more than any external pressure ever had. I had built my identity around being acceptable, reliable, predictable. The idea of becoming someone uncertain, contradictory, or misunderstood felt like social death. So I stayed within the lines, even as those lines cut deeper every year. I tried to bargain with myself. I told myself I could keep this life and still reclaim pieces of who I was. That I didn't need to burn everything down to feel whole. I made plans for later, promised myself I would change when things were calmer, when responsibilities eased, when I felt more confident. But later never arrived. It just kept moving further away, like a horizon that retreats as you walk toward it. The internal pressure built quietly. I became irritable, then ashamed of my irritability. I felt disconnected, then guilty for feeling disconnected. Every emotion turned inward, layered with judgment. I was angry at myself for being unhappy and unhappy because I refused to allow myself to be anything else. There were moments when I caught myself fantasizing about escape. Not a new life full of excitement, just absence. Silence. A pause. The idea of not having to perform, explain, or maintain anything felt dangerously comforting. That scared me enough to realize how close I was to a breaking point. I started withdrawing emotionally, even from people I cared about. Not because I stopped caring, but because caring required energy I no longer had. Conversations felt transactional. Relationships felt like obligations instead of connections. I hated myself for feeling that way, which only deepened the distance. At night, regret became more specific. I thought about the moments I had stayed quiet when something inside me was screaming. The times I chose being liked over being honest. The opportunities one ignored because they didn't fit the life I was already living. None of those choices were dramatic. That's what made them lethal. They accumulated invisibly, like interest on a debt I never intended to repay. The moral dilemma tortured me. Was it right to dismantle a life that wasn't broken, just misaligned? Was it ethical to prioritize an inner truth no one else could see over the stability of people who depended on me? I wanted a clean answer, a justification that would make leaving feel noble instead of selfish. It never came. What came instead was clarity. I realized that staying wasn't neutral. Every day I remained silent, I was actively choosing against myself. I wasn't preserving peace, I was postponing conflict by sacrificing my own presence. The harm was real, even if it was invisible to others. That realization broke something open. For the first time, I stopped judging my desire to leave as weakness. I started seeing it as a signal not of failure, but of self-respect trying to survive. The urge to escape wasn't about running away from responsibility. It was about running toward honesty. The fear shifted. I stopped being afraid of change and started being afraid of permanence. Afraid that if I stayed much longer, I wouldn't remember how to hear myself clearly. Afraid that my inner voice would fade into something so quiet I'd mistake its absence for peace. I began to imagine what it would mean to stop betraying myself, truly stop. Not partially. Not temporarily. The thought was terrifying. It meant discomfort. It meant confusion. It meant becoming someone others might not recognize or approve of. But it also meant one thing I hadn't felt in years: integrity. I didn't know exactly what leaving would look like. I didn't have a plan that made sense on paper. But the internal decision was forming, slow and irreversible. A line was being drawn, not in anger, not in rebellion, but in quiet refusal. I could no longer pretend that survival was enough. The moment denial collapses, choice becomes unavoidable. And I knew, deep down, that soon I would have to choose between continuing to betray myself or finally stepping into the discomfort of becoming real. There was no safe option anymore. Only an honest one. I didn't change my life all at once. I changed my loyalty. For years, my loyalty had been to stability, to predictability, to being the version of myself that caused the least friction. When I finally understood that, the decision wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and terrifying and deeply personal. I stopped asking how to fix my life and started asking who I was protecting by staying the same. The answer was uncomfortable. I was protecting everyone else from my truth. Leaving didn't begin with action. It began with refusal. I refused to keep agreeing to things that hollowed me out. I refused to explain myself in ways that minimized my reality. I refused to keep translating my inner life into something easier for others to digest. Each refusal felt small, but together they shifted the center of my life back toward me. People noticed. Some called it distance. Some called it change. A few called it selfishness. I listened without defending myself, and that was new. I let their interpretations exist without trying to manage them. That was the price of no longer betraying myself, being misunderstood. There were moments when the guilt was overwhelming. When I questioned whether I was destroying something that only needed patience. When I wondered if I was confusing discomfort with destiny. But beneath the doubt, there was a calm I hadn't felt in years, a sense that even if I was wrong, I was finally being honest. The day I truly left the old version of my life, nothing external marked it. No dramatic goodbye. No irreversible act. Just a quiet realization that I was no longer available for a role that required my disappearance. I stopped maintaining the illusion. And when illusions stop being maintained, they collapse on their own. The aftermath was emptier than I expected. Without the structure I had relied on, my days felt exposed. There was space where certainty used to be. Silence where constant validation once lived. That emptiness frightened me, but it also felt clean. It didn't numb me, it asked something of me. I learned to sit with myself without distraction. To hear my thoughts without immediately correcting them. To feel emotions without rushing to label them productive or inappropriate. This wasn't healing in the way people like to romanticize. It was awkward, slow, and often uncomfortable. But it was real. I grieved the years I had spent betraying myself. That grief wasn't self-pity, it was recognition. You can't reclaim your life without mourning the time you lived it on someone else's terms. I allowed that grief to exist without turning it into shame. And then, slowly, something shifted. I began to trust myself again, not because I had all the answers, but because I was finally listening. Decisions became simpler, even when they were hard. I stopped asking what would make sense to others and started asking what I could live with. That question changed everything. I didn't become fearless. I became aligned. Alignment doesn't erase pain. It gives it meaning. It turns suffering from something you endure into something you understand. Even the difficult days felt honest. Even uncertainty felt preferable to numbness. I still think about the person I was when I chose safety over truth. I don't judge them. I understand them. That version of me did what they knew how to do to survive. But survival is not the same as living, and confusing the two is how people lose entire lifetimes quietly. If you're listening to this and feeling that familiar ache, the sense that you're admired for a life you don't fully inhabit, I want to tell you to walk away. I want to tell you to start over. Those choices are personal, costly, and complex. But I will tell you this, every time you betray yourself to remain acceptable, you teach the world how to ignore you. And one day, you may realize that the hardest betrayal wasn't theirs, it was yours. I betrayed myself slowly until I forgot who I was. I found myself again the moment I stopped trying to be easy to live with. My life isn't perfect now. But it's mine. And that has made all the difference.